Order, order. Welcome back to this hearing of the Foreign Affairs Committee. As part of our inquiry into the Middle East and North Africa, we're doing hearings today on Iran, specifically in this panel on Iran's nuclear ambitions. We have a very esteemed panel who we are delighted to have with us. So Mark Lyall Grant, if you could kindly introduce yourself.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Mark Lyall Grant. I was a former diplomat, ambassador to the United Nations and National Security Advisor between 2015 and 2017.
Baroness Ashton.
I'm Cathy Ashton. I was the former EU High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy from 2009 to 2014, and in that position led the P5+1 or E3+3 talks with Iran on their nuclear program.
Thank you. And Mike.
I'm Mike Singh. I also am a former diplomat. I was Senior Director for the Middle East at the National Security Council during the George W. Bush administration, responsible for Iran policy in that regard. I'm currently Managing Director of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy in Washington, D.C.
Fabulous. Well, Randall's going to kick us off.
Thank you. Perhaps I could get to Baroness Ashton first. Let me put it very, very simply. Is there any life left in the JCPOA?
There isn't any life left in the JCPOA in the context of a formal agreement that we can rely on and that we can look to guarantee that Iran is not building a nuclear weapon. Informally, there are still plenty of links going on that have the potential to enable us to use elements of the JCPOA to continue to try and safeguard ourselves in the context of Iran's nuclear weapons. So the formal side doesn't exist really, in the sense that it's not a formal agreement under the UN Security Council, but the informal means that there are still elements that are in operation.
Sir Mark, do you agree with that?
Yes, I would agree with that. I think it's fair to say that it's on life support, but I don't think it's in the West's interest to kill it off entirely. There are certain steps that could be taken to do that, but as long as there is the possibility of still having some diplomacy around the prevention of Iran acquiring a nuclear weapon, I think we have to keep every avenue open to achieve that.
Baroness Ashton, what do you think the United Kingdom could actually be doing right now then to make sure that bringing folks back to the table remains an option at all in the future?
In my experience, I think the most important thing is to do two things at once. One is to continue to work with our colleagues in Europe and across the Atlantic. And as far as possible, certainly with China, impossible I recognise with Russia, to try and make sure that the context and context that we have are not completely lost, so that we continue to try and develop strategies and ideas, if you like, as a team. And then secondly, and linked to that, to find ways to keep talking to Iran. I spent 4.5 years, huge amounts of time on the Iran nuclear issues and on the talks. And you can argue that certainly in the President Ahmadinejad years, that was not necessarily going to go anywhere. And I'm sure Mike will have comments about that. But it paid off in the sense that we had a process and we had a way of collaborating together as well as talking with Iran. So when we were able to move forward, it was easy to slot into that. And I think it's important to find ways to keep things alive, even though I agree with Mark, it's life support, but it's still worth having.
And so perhaps I could turn to Mr. Singh as well then. So Baroness Ashton gave you an in to the question, but also, I mean, do you think that there are other existing policies or economic mechanisms that could also prove useful?
Well, I think that JCPOA has been dead for some time, and obviously Iran has moved forward quite rapidly with its nuclear program, and it's quite an advanced nuclear program now. And as Iran has moved forward, our policy options have narrowed considerably. And so I think it's not so much a question of, could we bring Iran back to the table? I think that, Iran is generally always willing to come to the table and negotiate, sometimes seriously, sometimes not seriously. I think the question is, what could we possibly do to motivate Iran to halt its nuclear progress, or, ideally pull it back, reverse it to a point where we can be comfortable Iran couldn't rapidly have a nuclear weapon. And I think at this stage, yes, that would require the application of various forms of pressure, and even then would be quite challenging. So sanctions, absolutely. The threat of military attack absolutely would need to be part of the equation. And I think those things would be quite challenging to mount at this stage of the game.
Could I add perhaps one point to what the other two have said, is that we shouldn't forget that for 10 years this was an E3+3 negotiation. And that meant it involved the Russians and the Chinese. And for many years we were able to work with them because there was a common goal. And interestingly, certainly during the time that I was the sort of lead negotiator for the UK, there was a subtle difference between the Russian attitude and the Chinese attitude. The Russian attitude was that they did not want a nuclear-armed Iran as a neighbour. And they were prepared to pay some political price, some economic price, in order to prevent that happening. China was a slightly different situation. They took the view that a nuclear-armed Iran wasn't a particular strategic problem for China, and therefore they weren't willing to impose the sort of sanctions which would have some consequences for China. Their mantra always was, we're happy to sanction Iran, but we're not prepared to sanction Chinese companies. Russia had a more open attitude. Now, obviously, since then, and particularly in the last couple of years, Russia has moved closer to Iran because of the Ukrainian invasion. But nonetheless, I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that there is an overlap of interest between us and at least the Russians in preventing Iran to have nuclear weapons. And I think we need to deploy that as best we can.
And as well as thinking about diplomatic efforts, as well as thinking about economic efforts, Mr. Singh mentioned sanctions as well, are there other mechanisms that we should be thinking about?
Well, there's always things you can think about. I mean, the obvious one is a snapback, implementing the snapback mechanism in the JCPOA. But that is essentially, excuse the phrasing, a sort of nuclear weapon of itself. I mean, it would basically put an end to the JCPOA. So I wouldn't recommend that at this stage. But certainly making sure that Iran does not feel as comfortable as it apparently appears to be at the moment, gradually building up stockpiles, continuing to breach the JCPOA arrangements, then somehow we need to find ways of making them less comfortable, but without completely blowing the whole thing out of the water. Because then we're left with military action. And of course, that is always an option, but it is a last resort. And of course, it has very uncertain consequences.
And if I may ask one last question to Baroness Ashton, given your experience in the European Union's context, what role do you see the EU having with regards to the future of engagement with Iran on this issue? Is there the appetite, is there the will to take tough decisions to try and to make progress and ideally reach some resolution?
Well, certainly in my time in office, the EU was an important ally to the United States, especially on sanctions, because EU countries all stuck together, all followed the lead of the E3, almost unquestioning in their attitude. They absolutely trusted Britain, France and Germany working together to operate for the EU. And as you know, under the UN, the role of the High Representative, my role, was designated as the person to coordinate and lead the talks. So there was a very strong EU connection and commitment, working extremely collaboratively, especially with the US. There's no question that economic issues have a role to play in all of this. It's very relevant to remember that when President Rouhani came into office at the end of Ahmadinejad's term, he did so on a sort of manifesto that said he would resolve the economic challenges that were faced by Iranian people, and there was no way he could do that unless he could lift sanctions. So the sanctions were very, very effective in that particular context. And so there's still the potential for the European Union, I think, to play a role both in terms of its sanctioning ability and, if you like, the carrot part of the equation, which is always to be remembered because it can have its uses in terms of opening up the economy. So there is definitely something that could be done there. Whether there's a real appetite to put this high on the agenda, I think is harder to say. It's harder to say because other priorities are quite clearly taking over and we are in a different time.
So, Cathy, just to push you on that slightly, so my concern is that on the EU agenda, this is very low down, even though realistically, if we look at the foremost, guarantor of instability within the Middle East, it is Iran. Roads seem to lead back to Iran increasingly. And again, as we've had the conversations, the lack of restraint has enabled. Spain, for example, chose not to take part in the recent Red Sea airstrikes despite the fact they have a frigate in the region. We're not seeing France, Germany, others stepping up. Germany's obviously coming to terms with their Zeitenwende when it comes to Ukraine alone. So surely we can't rely on the EU to really lead on this, and therefore that takes us to the US, but obviously they're in election period and Trump has said that Iran would be a priority for him, but I think the phrase is aggressive containment is what he'd be looking at.
Well, there are two or three things I'd quickly comment on that. The first is I don't underestimate the disappointment that there was within European countries when President Trump effectively pulled the plug on the JCPOA. All of the efforts, all of the years of work were thrown away in that context. And it was quite clear that having done that, we'd have to go back to square one and think again. And there is no real sense that they can rely on the US to continue with it because it is down to presidential action, not down to Congress. And so even if President Trump elected or President Biden re-elected continued in a similar path, you don't know what's coming down the track. And as economic issues are so important, long-term investment is critical. Companies do not invest long-term if they can't see the stability. Second thing is that it is a different set of questions in terms of military action with Iran. There are always within the EU countries who are more reluctant to engage. And there is always a bigger question mark for some countries about what happens next. We've seen this historically in many actions that have been taken over the years, where you can get 2 or 3 countries to be very, very proactive, and others who say, we don't want to do something that might make the situation worse in their eyes, that might invite this problem to get bigger, it might invite the war to grow. And I think what you're seeing is because action has happened relatively swiftly, I wonder if some of the diplomatic action underneath it needs to be strengthened so that you can have those conversations.
Thank you.
We're not there, obviously, in the EU able to do that, so it does rely on the US to be able to do more of it.
Thank you very much. Bob?
Just to follow up, if I may, Samart, you were saying that there was an overlap, which you explained very eloquently, the overlap between our interests and the Russian interests. Given now the very sort of hardening of relations, the hardening of Russia's approach to the West, its intense dislike of it, the fact that it sees itself in a geopolitical struggle with the West, to what extent does that blind them to your original proposition about them not wanting a nuclear-armed Iran? And is the price of significant Iranian drone and other support in the Ukraine war, is the cost to Russia that they have to hand over some kind of ballistic technology or some advanced technology that is going to help the Iranians either make strides in conventional weaponry or potentially nuclear weaponry?
Well, I think there's definitely a risk that the equation in Putin's mind has changed because of Russia's increasing reliance on Iran. I haven't seen any evidence myself that they are promising technology transfer to Iran as part of that overall deal, but I think it does change the equation that I mentioned earlier about Russia being willing to pay a price in order to prevent Iran acquiring nuclear weapons. But I don't think it changes their fundamental interest that they do not really want to see an Iranian nuclear power on their doorstep. And that, I think that issue is still there.
And that attitude is still absolutely firm, given the close, what we've been talking about, the closer relationship between the Iranians and the Russians, and there is this much more intense military and sort of geopolitical relationship.
Who can say what Putin's latest thinking is? But in my view, in terms of the deep strategy of Russia, that hasn't fundamentally changed. It's easy to forget that the whole rationale behind the JCPOA process and negotiations was to prevent us reaching the famous fork in the road, as it used to be called, where either we had to accept a nuclear-armed Iran or we bombed them to stop it happening. Both of those choices obviously are deeply unpalatable, and that's why we went the extra mile for year after year through these negotiations to try and reach an agreement. Maybe the fork in the road is much closer than it was. Undoubtedly, it is, but I don't think we've quite run out of road for some form of negotiation.
Thank you.
And Mike, turning to you, people often talk about Iran's assembly and deployment of, let's focus on assembly because I don't think anyone can talk about deployment, but assembly of nuclear weapons to now be an inevitability. What's your perspective on that?
I don't think it's an inevitability. Making nuclear weapons isn't a straightforward task, but, Iran is certainly extremely close. So Iran could have the weapons-grade uranium for a single nuclear weapon in a matter of about 7 days, we think, and could have enough for 6 nuclear weapons in a month. We do know that Iran has the delivery vehicles they would need for nuclear weapons. And so the time-consuming bit, as it were, would be the actual weaponization element between the fuel fabrication and marrying the fuel to a delivery vehicle. And this goes back, I think, to what Sir Mark was saying, is that, look, they could get international assistance with these pieces and perhaps shorten that timeline. And that, I think, is where we do need to be concerned about the role that Russia could play. I would respectfully disagree with Sir Mark. I think we have seen a sea change from Russia in terms of its approach towards non-proliferation issues in general. And I don't think we can have any confidence that Russia is still committed, if in fact it ever really was very strongly, to preventing Iran from having a nuclear weapon. I think that there's every reason to worry that Russia could help Iran at this stage. I think, though, there's also reason to worry that even without Russian assistance, Iran could undertake many of the weaponization activities it would need to take in a clandestine manner. So Iran is building, quite alarmingly, a new underground facility in the Natanz region. The IAEA has written about this in their reports. They've not informed the IAEA of the purpose of this facility. And it is possible that Iran could conduct the necessary activities in this type of facility. And even if it takes Iran something like 6 months to build a small nuclear arsenal, we would actually have much shorter notice in terms of the intelligence warning of that. So it's not an inevitability, but I think it's quite close.
And just on that, if they were to reach the capability of having a nuclear weapon, do we think they'd announce it? Do we think it's something they'd want to proactively share and use, therefore, as deterrence and to show they have more arsenal? And secondly, more importantly, how do we prevent it if we can?
My assumption is that, yes, they would want us to know. They would want to announce it, whether that it means a test or whether that simply means saying, look, we have it. Because, of course, a lot of the value of having nuclear weapons is other countries knowing that you have them. So I think that's something we should expect. And we should expect that Iran wouldn't produce just a single weapon, but it would want multiple weapons as insurance against, potential strike. So we are to the point where, again, our policy options are quite narrow. The intelligence warning will be quite short. And so we do need to think, I think, quite seriously about all the options that we might consider last resorts. In a sense, we don't know that we're at the last resort and that we don't know when Iran will actually make the decision or if it will at all to cross the threshold or if it will remain on this side of the threshold. But anything you might consider a last resort option, now is the time to be considering that.
So, Kathy and Mark, what would you be doing if you were sat over in King Charles Street trying to decide what the UK could be doing to prevent Iran getting to the final stages of having a nuclear weapon?
So, should I start?
Please, sorry, Kathy, yes.
Yeah. So I'd be talking to Saudi Arabia because the rapprochement that we're beginning to see between Saudi and Iran is really important. It was partly done in Beijing, as you know, by the Chinese, but that's an important relationship on both sides. And it's often misunderstood, but it's been an important relationship for both. So I'd be talking to the Saudis about Iran. I would be trying to continue some level of dialogue with Iran. I'm not somebody who thinks, well, the obvious thing is let's go to the last resorts now. We have to do everything we can to end up anywhere but the last resorts. And I'd be looking to other countries in the region who could give advice and support from as to how they would want to approach this. And that includes, at some level, whether we have any contact still with Russia. I'm not somebody, as you can imagine, from all that I've done in my work on Ukraine, who easily says that. But certainly the Russians did not play the most significant role, but they did play a role. And I slightly disagree with Mr. Singh, and because my experience of 4.5 years with the Russians, for a week a month for most of it, was that they were very, very keen to not have Iran with a nuclear weapon. They were very concerned about even giving Iran control of the facilities that Russia had built, because they were concerned about the quality of the way in which Iran might look after them, that they could become a risk. And there was no suggestion to me other than that they wanted to make sure that there was not a nuclear-armed Iran. And as for the Chinese, though they took a different view, and Sir Marcus rightly identified it, there was a sense that having a region which could become very quickly nuclear-armed, not just with Iran, but beyond Iran, was something that China did not see was going to be in its interests, economically, politically, or in any other way. So we still have some of these underpinning issues as to where countries sit with this. So I would be talking to the European Union, I'd be talking to the Americans, of course, I would be talking to the region, but especially to Saudi Arabia.
Thank you. Mark, I know that Royston actually wants to touch on something very similar, so I might let him come to you.
Thank you. Mike, is the posture of the West encouraging or discouraging Iran's proliferation activities, do you think?
Well, I have to unfortunately judge that our posture is encouraging Iranian proliferation activities, not actively perhaps, but certainly passively, because Iran really is not paying a price either for moving ahead with its own nuclear program or for the activities we see in support of proxies like the Houthis, where Iran is providing really quite advanced capabilities to very irresponsible actors in the Houthis or in Hezbollah. What we have seen over the past several years is that U.S. sanctions, especially against Iran, have not been vigorously enforced. So, in fact, Iran's oil exports are at, high points, pre-sanctions highs even. So Iran is really pulling in quite a bit of revenue through trade with the Chinese, let's say. When it comes to actions, for example, that the Houthis have taken against international shipping, shutting down essentially commercial shipping through the Red Sea, the Houthis have suffered some strikes as a result of that. But Iran, as has often been the case in the past, really pays no price itself for the actions that it enables and makes possible. So I don't think that we've landed on an effective non-proliferation policy with respect to Iran. I have to add into that a piece of the discussion which came earlier, which is the E3, I must say, have been so reluctant to exercise the snapback mechanism in the JCPOA, even though the E3 are the only parties who are still committed to the JCPOA, and this mechanism was built into the agreement, essentially to address exactly the situation we have now, which is Iranian noncompliance and Iran's march forward with its nuclear program. But in fact, what we see is that the E3 are quite deterred from exercising snapback by Iranian threats.
Are there any opportunities for the UK to use whatever leverage it does have more effectively?
Well, I think that what the UK could do, beyond whatever sort of sanctions power it has, but I think we have to be sort of realistic a bit that ultimately what we have seen in the past is that, without US enforcement of sanctions, I'm not sure that UK sanctions will be able to play a big role. Although things like the proscription of the IRGC, I think would be positive steps forward. I think the power and the leverage that the UK has, it does come perhaps to that snapback mechanism in the JCPOA. If in fact we feel as though that's not something that Iran would want to see, because perhaps of what might follow, because of the international isolation that could follow, then I think it behooves the UK to think about how to use that leverage to affect Iranian calculations. But I'm not sure that we have seen that now. In fact, we've seen the opposite. We've seen Iran affecting UK, French, and German calculations in a much more effective way.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you ever so much, Royce and Dan.
Thank you, Chair. The issue of sanctions has come up a couple of times already today. Sir Mark, can I come to you? Why is there a sense that sanctions today are going to be less effective than they have been in the past?
Well, sanctions have been very effective in the Iranian context in order to get Iran to the negotiating table. The JCPOA would not have been negotiated had it not been for the sanctions and the threat of more sanctions. But what made those sanctions effective was that they were universal. They were agreed with the Russians and the Chinese eventually, or watered down by them, but nonetheless agreed by them, and they were endorsed by the UN Security Council. That has an impact. The trouble with sanctions now, I mean, Mr. Singh was saying they're not effective without the Americans, but the reality is they're not effective without the Russians and the Chinese. As we've seen, the diversion of Iranian trade goes, without any particular problems to China and Russia. So I don't think there are individual sanctions that the United Kingdom could produce which would have any impact really strategically on Iran. I agree that Iran is relatively comfortable at the moment, but what we're seeing more widely in the region, I don't know if we could come onto the region, is that Iran wants to keep the situation bubbling without passing a threshold of escalation which would lead to a wider regional conflict. And I think myself that they're probably in the same mindset when it comes to the nuclear breakout. So they are comfortable in the situation they are now, where they're developing stockpiles, they're developing enrichment, but they're still several days, weeks away from that breakout capability. And I don't think they would rush into announcing that they are a nuclear power, because that would bring into play a much wider range of countries in the world than is in play at the moment, because that would be directly against UN Security Council resolutions, for instance. So I don't think they feel they need to breach that threshold any more than they are breaching the threshold by, expanding Hezbollah or expanding the war with using Hamas and the Houthis.
I just follow, but I mean, effectively, you're describing a status quo that doesn't exist, because you're saying, well, nothing dramatic has happened, but actually, what is happening is that Iran is developing nuclear weapons, and at some point in the next year, 3 years, is going to announce this to the world in some way, or will find an opportunity to do so, or will be pushed into a position where it decides to do it, reacting to events. So, the danger is that Iran is now becoming a nuclear power, a nuclear armed state as we talk. So I'm not being very articulate, but I'm trying to articulate a sort of sense of urgency when you're basically saying we're in a status quo situation. We're not. We're in a position where Iran is about to test or have the capability to have nuclear weapons. That's really significant and serious, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not suggesting that we are comfortable. What I was saying was that Iran is comfortable in not taking that final step over the threshold because of the consequences they think that they will face. But you're absolutely right. I mean, we're not in any sort of comfortable position. But I'm also saying that we, as the United Kingdom, do not have the leverage through sanctions to change that dynamic.
I mean, once Iran signs the threshold, step over that threshold, all that preparation work, all the preparation work has been done. It's not like it's going to take a great deal of time. It is going to be standing one side of a line, and the following day it then crosses that line, and the world sort of changes again in a very dramatic way, and that effectively is happening now. Just a question related to that, if I may, Samar. You said that we also need the Russians and the Chinese. I mean, I'm sure I'm not disagreeing with that, but it is also true that the American sanctions on Iran were surprisingly successful, weren't they, the last time that they were significantly imposed? Would you agree with that or not?
Which latest round of sanctions?
The sanctions, when they had been imposed in the past on Iran, were surprisingly effective.
Absolutely, at bringing them to the negotiating table.
And that was minus, forget about Russia and forget about China there. That was effectively US-controlled sanctions, sort of access to international markets, all markets. That worked really well, didn't it?
It did work well, but it was because it was agreed by the international community, and the Russian and Chinese were part of that. I'm not aware of any sanctions since President Trump pulled out of the JCPOA that have been effective on Iran.
Okay.
Perfect. Can I... Actually, I'm going to take us to the region, and then I'm going to come back to the UK, actually. Please, Ranal.
Thank you. We've talked a little bit in passing about some parts of the region. In terms of the negotiations in the past and all the parties involved in the past, we've discussed Russia and China. What about the Arab states themselves? What role could they play, not only in the region with one of their neighbours, who is a problem to them, but also in ongoing British policy towards Iran? Samar?
Well, I agree with Baroness Ashton on this, that Saudi Arabia is an important player in this respect. But what is striking in the region for me over the last 15 to 20 years is the lack of Arab agency. The three most important countries in the region are now Israel, Turkey, and Iran. None of them Arab states. And the traditional Arab powers in the region, whether that's Egypt or Syria or Saudi Arabia, have all had their problems and have not played any sort of leadership role for the last sort of 15 years since the Arab Spring, anyway. And when you look at the fact that Russia and China have also become much more involved from outside, you're suddenly finding that the Arabs have got very little agency over the future of the region. Now, they haven't helped themselves, of course, with the split they had over with Qatar in the Gulf Cooperation Council. Now that that has been solved, now that Saudi Arabia is beginning to stick its head above the parapet a little bit in a leadership role, I think there is an opportunity maybe to bring the Arab leaders back into play. Because although there is this reconciliation of sorts between, or rapprochement anyway, between Saudi Arabia and Iran, Saudi Arabia would be horrified at the prospect of an Iranian nuclear bomb, and of course would put a great deal of pressure on Pakistan to acquire the technology necessary to have one of their own in response. And so they can play a role, particularly now they have a channel to Iran, in helping for that not to happen.
Even states like Qatar, that as you mentioned, have had regular problems with a near neighbour, and they share those challenges, even though there was the blockade in the GCC. So, given that this is a shared problem, and given that, as you say, Saudi could play an important role here, how do we? How could Britain do more to encourage this? How could Britain do more to make sure that our policy and theirs are more aligned, given that the risks are in some part the same?
Well, the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary, and I think the Foreign Secretary may be going again, to the region, is absolutely not just going to Israel or the West Bank, but going to the region to try and deploy the influence we have, and we have quite a lot of influence with the Gulf states and with some of the other regional players, to try and encourage them to respond to the many crises that are happening across the region. It's very striking that if you look at Saudi Arabia, although they are the architects of a recent truce with the Houthis, they are not publicly condemning British and American strikes against the Houthis, because they know that it is not in their interests for the Houthis to be, blocking shipping in the Red Sea. It's actually not in China's interest for that to happen either, and I think there's a role for China to rein in the Houthis on that respect as well. So I think there are things Britain can do because we do have influence in the region. There's been a sort of tilt towards the Gulf region in particular in recent security and defence reviews, and we can now mobilise some of that credit and influence we have to help manage the Iranian problem.
May I just probe on that final point? You said sort of mobilise. Is there something we need to do, whether that's through the Royal Navy or otherwise, to provide our friends in the region with greater certainty that they can play a more active role? Are there those sorts of, I don't want to use the words incentives, it's not an incentive, but those forms of guarantees that we need to provide? Is that what you think would actually move the dial here, or is it something else?
I'm talking more of sort of diplomatic engagement rather than security guarantees. I mean, we do have strong security bilateral relationships with many of the countries in the region, but I wouldn't want to overhype those, because compared to the American interests in the region, it's relatively small. But nonetheless, as I say, we have some influence in places where the Americans don't always have as much influence, and I think we can deploy that.
Kathy, was there anything you wanted to add on that?
I think just a couple of points from things that have been said. The first is on the sanctions question. There was an underpinning of UN Security Council sanctions that included China and Russia, and then there was an overlay of United States sanctions joined by the EU. And the role of Russia and China in that was, though they didn't agree with the overlay, they didn't do anything to undermine them. They just complained about them. And that meant that we had a really strong sanctions package at that point, which led us to be able to move forward towards the JCPOA. And then on the region, you know, we shouldn't forget Turkey, and I'm very glad Sir Mark mentioned Turkey, because when we began the negotiations proper with Iran, and certainly in my time, Turkey was a really important player in that. They had a strong relationship with Iran. They certainly didn't want to see a nuclear-armed Iran either. And then finally, to just reinforce what Sir Mark has said, Iran knows, in a sense, that there are things it can do to make us all very well aware of its capability to get to creating the circumstances where it could build a bomb. It has to still build it, remember. And it has been playing a game for some years now of ratcheting up very carefully so it doesn't do something that will trigger the military response, which in the end would be the way that we would respond to it. And so I think what Sir Mark is alluding to is we're still in that area. It's grey, we're not sure, but were we beginning to think that maybe Iran is going to ratchet up and stop? And the reason it might stop is not so much to do with us, but to do with what's going on in the region and what's happening there. And then my final point would be, if I may, that one of the reasons we can't deal with Iran on some of these questions of the Houthis and Hezbollah and its support for Hamas, I think, is because the whole point of the JCPOA was to get rid of that boulder from the doorway that would enable us to then focus and concentrate on trying to stop Iran's role in the region, instead of which we're back talking about its capacity to get a nuclear weapon again. And that's one of the great tragedies of what happened on the JCPOA.
Thank you. Mike, one very short one from me, because I feel like we can't miss it. And then Royston wants to come back to you, Sir Mark. Mike, Iran and Pakistan, the last few weeks, can you just unpack for us very briefly what happened there and what we need to learn from it?
Sure. I'll stress, I think this is actually quite separate from the rest of the turmoil we've seen in the Middle East, except maybe insofar as, you know, Iran was sort of feeling a need to sort of demonstrate its will, or demonstrate its the fact that it isn't deterred from striking out when it is targeted. And of course, Iran was responding to a terrorist attack which had taken place inside Iran, targeting a commemoration ceremony for Qasem Soleimani. I think, though, that Iran overstretched in striking Pakistan. And it seemed as though Pakistan was determined to send the message to Iran that it could not strike even against, you know, militants within Pakistani territory, you know, without a Pakistani response due to the violation of Pakistan's sovereignty. And this sort of ultimately gets to this long-running issue of this quite lawless border region on both sides of the Iran-Pakistan border, the Balochistan region of both countries. A topic on which Iran and Pakistan have cooperated at times in the past, and at other times have been at odds over, although rarely trading blows as we've seen recently. So I think there was some sort of signaling by both sides. I don't anticipate that it will go any further, really, and both sides have signaled their desire to de-escalate because neither side really has an interest in pursuing conflict with one another. This isn't sort of a conflict between the two governments as much as it is sort of signaling on both sides about, determination and will and sovereignty and things like this. If I could just say, in response to one of the previous questions, I was asked whether an Iranian nuclear weapon is an inevitability. I do think some of what we're seeing from the region is treating an Iranian nuclear weapon as an inevitability. I think the policies of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and so forth are based, in a sense, on this, this view that Iran will get its weapon, that Iran is an incipient nuclear weapons state, and now needs to be, and the Arab states now need to adjust their policies accordingly, and that leads them both towards rapprochement with Iran, but also towards trying to strengthen their own security arrangements, both internally in the region, but also, for example, in Saudi Arabia's case, and maybe a little bit concerningly from our view, pursuing their own nuclear weapons capability, perhaps in the future.
Thank you very much. Royston.
Thank you, Chairman. In the last panel, we heard about the sort of weaponry, the amount of weaponry that the Houthis have, and of course that the Saudis spent years trying to deal with that threat. The US and the UK are now engaged in active strikes upon the Houthis. Is that likely to be in the UK's regional interests in the long term?
Certainly, I think it is. I think it has been the right response. I mean, arguably the actions by the Houthis to interdict commercial shipping through the Gulf, has a greater direct impact on the UK than the Israel-Gaza conflict does. It does affect us economically in a very sort of direct way. It does threaten the international world order in a very, and freedom of navigation in a very direct way. And I think it is therefore right to respond robustly to both defend our own ships, but also international shipping more generally. I don't think that risks a wider escalation. I don't think it will stop the Houthis from carrying out further attacks because they are quite resilient. They do have quite a lot of military capability, but that military capability is certainly being degraded by these strikes. And I don't think Iran will want the Houthis to sort of escalate beyond what they're doing at the moment. That doesn't mean that Iran is not happy with what's happening or that they will tell them to stop, which would be the ideal, or that they will stop supporting. But I don't think Iran is showing any signs of wanting this to escalate further.
Do you think as a result of our action that UK citizens are at any more risk, either at home or abroad, as a result of this?
I mean, arguably in the region, I don't think in the UK the Houthis are not active, as it were, in the UK in the same way that you could argue the IRGC and the Iranians and people are. But so I don't think there is a significant additional risk to UK nationals. Obviously, there is the regional dynamic, and that is something that we're going to have to watch because there is accusations of double speak, and no doubt we're going to hear some of that from some of the G20 partners. But I think as long as we have a measured and proportionate response, and we put it very clearly in terms of defending international shipping, which is in the interest of everyone, including Russia, including China, then there is no reason why that should be damaging. And as I mentioned before, it is striking that Saudi Arabia, other Arab countries, have not publicly criticized those actions. And the fact that the Houthis have no friends in the region was demonstrated at the United Nations, where even Russia and China were prepared to allow Resolution 2722, which actively, strongly, I think, condemned in the strongest possible terms what the Houthis were doing. They do not have many international friends.
Thank you.
Thank you, Fabian.
Just very briefly, if I may, really addressed to Mr. Singh, but I'd like to know what the other witnesses think. We've heard a lot about Iran becoming, being an incipient nuclear armed state. Doesn't this have profound implications for the Non-Proliferation Treaty? If Iran does imminently become, Bob just had an exchange as well about this, become a nuclear armed state, which should alarm everybody, will it not destroy the whole basis of the Non-Proliferation Treaty? Because, as Sir Mark said earlier, many of the neighbouring Arab states may well want to then develop their own weapons, especially Saudi Arabia, off the back of Pakistan. What's your view on this?
Well, in a word, yes. I would say the global non-proliferation regime is in tatters, and not just because of this issue, but certainly this issue is a strong contributor to that state of affairs, because we have Iran would be following North Korea as a sort of new state acquiring nuclear weapons, presumably without significant safeguards. We've seen a reduction in Iranian cooperation with the IAEA as it has gotten closer to sort of the nuclear weapons status. We have seen Saudi Arabia express an interest in nuclear weapons if Iran gets them, and that would also, again, raise questions about a sort of cascade of nuclear proliferation if Iran were to cross a threshold, or even, frankly, if it simply remains at the threshold that it's at, because, as I said, other states will have to, in a sense, treat it as a de facto nuclear weapons state. I think when you add this to the collapse of basically every arms control treaty that existed between the United States and Russia, we're in a very sort of difficult position when it comes to the global non-proliferation regime. And we need not only to think more seriously about how do we prevent states like Iran from crossing that threshold, but what will our policy be towards allies who then want nuclear weapons of their own? And that's something we have waffled about in the United States between administrations. And also the question of, is arms control going to be possible going forward between the nuclear armed states themselves? And I realize that's a bit beyond the remit of the committee, but these are reinforcing issues.
Sir Mark?
Yes, I mean, arguably, well, not arguably, it's a fact that the Non-Proliferation Treaty is already greatly weakened. I mean, Israel has nuclear weapons, they're not party to the NPT. India and Pakistan have nuclear weapons, they are not party to the NPT. And Iran, no doubt, would pull out of the NPT if it declared
I was going to say the difference is,
power.
Sorry to interrupt you, the difference is that Israel, Pakistan and India were never part of the NPT, whereas Iran has been a signatory for many years. I'm not
in any way downplaying the significance of the NPT. What I'm saying is the NPT is not a sort of watertight treaty already. There were originally 5 nuclear powers, there are now 8 nuclear powers. And of course you've got 9 because you've got North Korea as well. So in that sense, it's already a heavily damaged treaty. But nonetheless, of course, it would give further damage to it, not because of the treaty structure, but because of the impact on Saudi Arabia. Iran might say, we're doing this in response to Israel in the same way that India and Pakistan said it was because of each other. But, of course, Saudi Arabia would see it as a potential threat to themselves.
Baroness Ashton, finally.
I think the NPT is, in some senses, bigger than even Iran. Iran is a signatory. It was on the basis of the NPT that the UN took the original sanctions. It was on the basis of the NPT that we were able to do all the negotiations. And I spent far too many hours debating elements of the NPT with the Iranians about their capacity to have any kind of program because of what the NPT says about cooperation between signatories and the ability to have this civil program and so on. So it does provide a framework for negotiations. And I would be very reluctant to say, because Iran has behaved as it is, the whole thing is over and dead. I think you always have to keep the instruments that work in part and try and add to them and build on them. And without question, other signatories may well have not taken actions that they could have taken because they were part of the NPT. So yes, in the context of Iran, it's a terrible thing to happen if this goes forward. In other ways, we should be looking at keeping the treaty and reinforcing it, not ripping it up.
Thank you.
I need to wrap us up in the next 6 minutes. Bob, did you want to come in with a question before I've got a final one?
That's okay, thank you.
Oh, sure. So just very finally, so Mark, we're spending a lot of time talking about Iran and the region, but obviously you were the former National Security Advisor. We can't let you go without asking you about your advice about what you think we should be doing at home to make sure that we are safer. Obviously, saw MI5 make that extraordinary decision to be very clear about what Iran has been doing on our shores. We saw obviously a documentary last night that showed IRGC generals zooming with national student groups across the UK. What more would you be urging a government to do, or what reviews would you be calling for to make sure that we are protecting ourselves against an Iran that is increasingly willing to export their terrorism to UK shores?
Well, this is an area where sanctions certainly can play a role. The government has sanctioned individuals of the IRGC and has sanctioned the IRGC as a whole, and it can continue to do that. Of course, the theoretical next step is to prescribe the organisation of the IRGC as a whole as a terrorist organisation, but I think one would have to think very carefully before doing that, because you are essentially prescribing an organ of the state, and that would immediately break all diplomatic relations between the UK and Iran. But if there is a way of sanctioning more individuals without pushing that final step, then I think that should be done. They are not by any means the most active in this country, threatening our interests. There are a number of other bodies, and I think it's right that the intelligence agencies offer advice on a regular basis to update where the threats are coming from. Just moved on Hizb ut-Tahrir, in my view, many years too late. There are other organisations that are spreading hatred and extremism in this country, and of course they need to be looked at and monitored. And any Iranian organisations fall into that category. Yeah. But I say the difference of the IRGC compared to these other groups is that they are organs of the state, and therefore one has to be careful.
The US did prescribe the IRGC, and obviously some might say that was, very much led from the President's office, but they still managed to exercise influence. They're still important. They may not have their embassy on the ground anymore.
They don't have diplomatic relations with Iran. I mean, there is no embassy on the ground, hasn't been for 30 years or more.
They're still the player we're talking about most in terms of what happens with Iran. So whilst I recognise that as diplomats you always want to have an embassy, you always want to have people on the ground, the same conversation is taking place about Afghanistan. Iran is a terrorist state. If we look at what we want to do to stabilise the Middle East, all roads come back to Iran in some way, shape or form, although there's a lot of work that we need to do more broadly on things like two-state solutions. Is the reality not that Iran is a terrorist state, the IRGC is a terrorist organisation? We shouldn't allow, like we wouldn't allow organised crime groups who are co-opted by government to be protected just because they were, you look at perhaps Serbia, where some organised crime groups, they are serving the state, they are elements and organs of the state, but that wouldn't stop us from sanctioning them. The Americans are still important. Surely we need to get over our obsession with having an embassy on the ground when it's not necessarily delivering meaningful outcomes.
I 100% accept that it is a legitimate policy discussion to have, but you need to weigh up the cons as well as the pros. Yes, and one of the questions is, how effective would sanctioning the IRGC have? Would that achieve something that sanctioning individual members of the IRGC, banning them from doing whatever they're doing in the UK, would it add to that? Would it make much difference? And then put that against the downsides, which would completely disrupt your relations. It's not just about the embassy on the ground, although that's important in terms of protecting British nationals, dual nationals, consular activities, all that sort of stuff you cannot do directly if you don't have an embassy on the ground. But it's the whole panoply of the relationship between the two countries. So, yes, it's a legitimate discussion to have. As of today, I'm not sure that I would be advising taking that step.
Cathy, I'm going to give you the last word because it feels like you've got something unspoken to be said. So please do, and then I'll wrap us up.
I think we shouldn't underestimate the threat. We shouldn't underestimate that this is going to get potentially worse. We shouldn't fail to have thought through scenarios and ideas that are the worst case as well as the best case. But in the midst of all that, it's really important that we still have opportunities to talk not to the Iranian regime, but to people who live and work in Iran. And one of the reasons I'm always in favour of having something on the ground is not necessarily to talk to the state, because they don't much want to talk to you, but there are opportunities, in my experience, to be able to talk to people who live there, to be able to make those connections. And it is for the people that you want to do things as well. So let's be clear-eyed and realistic and as tough as we need to be, but let's also use what we've got, the soft power bits, to good effect.
Wise words. Well, with that, I thank you all so much, particularly given how difficult it's been for some of you to be with us today. We're really very grateful. And our inquiry will continue next week looking at Libya and Yemen. So thank you all ever so much. Order, order. That brings a close to this session.